are we going to talk about today? What are economic debates really about? Just real short. You're going to get a cheat sheet, which is a really annoying word to pronounce. It's going to be like big and intimidating, but we'll run through it because the intuition is what really matters. We're going to talk about the World Trade Organization, the IMF and World Bank. What are they? What do they do? Do they know things? Let's find out. Why do we have different currencies? Which is going to be like a bit of a casus-based analysis of the European Union, but also what was before and after that, because you know, we might get a debate on that. And then we're going to give you an extension on Chinese investors that you're never going to use, but it's cool for me to tell you because it's very, it's as debating as it's going to get. Then we're going to practice with a quick debate. I think we can. Yeah. So, what are economic debates really about? They're about two things. They're about making pies bigger, and they're about dividing said pies. What the fuck am I? Sitting over there.
Well, because then the camera will shake.
I'm lonely.
Okay. For the camera,
Aren't you staying?
Mike decided to destroy the room's balance by doing that. Okay. So, they're about two things. They're about making a pie bigger and about cutting it up and getting about who gets which parts of the pie. Sounds very intuitive, but people generally only talk about one of these two things. About is the economy going to grow as a whole, or like is a larger portion of the money going to go to poor people? But if you realize that you can basically, so usually by dividing the pie more unevenly, you can also make the entire pie grow. By making a few people richer, they can invest in more factories, etc. But it basically means that the economy as a whole becomes more skewed in income, unless it's in like income division and whatnot. And that means you can basically debate about what you think is more important. Is it more important to have a fair society or to have one that is as rich as possible? And just always remember this, because even if there's a dynamite team that's like fully explaining why the pie will become bigger, if you can explain why, that doesn't really mean that most people will be better off. You can still take that debate. And the other way around, if you can explain that even though it's going to be, the economy is going to be much less equal, everyone in general is going to be better off, it might still be worth passing the policy. So this is a big scary cheat sheet. It is a table. But we're just going to run through quickly. You really don't need to remember this. It's just a quick characterization. So we have 5 different countries or entities. The United States, the European Union, Japan, because nobody ever talks about Japan. We really should talk about Japan. China and Brazil, because Brazil is like a nice developing country that people don't really talk about often as much because they like talking about China and about Russia. But Brazil is also very important. Okay. United States, European Union, Japan, to some degree, are like democratic states. China is authoritarian. We'll get into what that actually means for economics specifically a bit later on. And then we get to Brazil, which is normally the democratic, but in which power is... Don't you need like a notebook, David?
I never write down notes.
Okay, sure. Which is normally democratic, but because corruption runs rampant, it basically means that, for example, the media and the people in government are all like the same elite, the same group that can basically divide whatever they want across one another. The economic system is kind of related to this. So in the US, we see like a pretty free market system with little regulation in general, at least federal regulation, and a lot of freedom for individual economic actors. In the European Union and Japan, we see more of a mix where the government takes a more active role, has a couple of government corporations, takes an active stake in the government, and this is not so much, this is not just about what governments do and how governments think, it's also about the culture in a certain economy, right? The effect that this will have. If you try to implement like a state-owned corporation in the US, you're bound to reach a lot of resistance because people aren't used to that. Whereas in the European Union, Japan, it's more normal for the government to take such an active role and basically easier to pass political legislation on these kind of things. Then we get to China, which is mixed and planned. We'll talk about that a bit more specifically later, but it basically means that China has a shit ton of corporations that are owned by the government. The government really cares about if people are employed or not, because that is basically the way that China actually gathers most of its legitimacy. By giving people a good job and making sure to get more money tomorrow than they have today, that is how they stay in power, because there's no democratic way for them to be elected. They need like the implicit support of the people, and to get that, they basically try to get these people to be better off. Then Brazil is a mixed economic system. Now, why is that? It's because corrupt officials love having corporations that are in government control. They can give them to people they like, they can basically spread corruption and entrench their own power. So it's very unlikely that even though, in general, liberal policies have proven to be quite successful in the past, it's very hard for a country like Brazil to start endogenously passing these laws and making these corporations privatized, because there's a lot of vested interest in keeping them in government control, because the government can appoint who runs these companies, how to run, and for whose profit they run. So this basically feeds into the corruption. It makes the corruption stronger, but also it makes it likelier that these corporations will stay in government control. So notice that most of these countries, basically firms appoint their personnel, right? So I'm not talking about the state government, the state-owned corporations. I'm talking about like a regular corporation, like a shop or whatever. So in most of these, firms themselves decide who they want to run that company. So if, for example, you're a major company and you have shareholders because you've sold part of your company to a majority of outsiders, then they get to decide who runs that company. In China, even they don't really do this. So what happens if your company is big enough? It's probably been set up by the government. The government can appoint directly who's in like a specific company. That is a very strong incentive for any CEO in any of these corporations, or to basically do whatever the Chinese government does. The Chinese government doesn't even need to tell you to, because you know that you're going to lose your job if you don't follow their implicit structure. So it's a very powerful tool for government to basically control economic policy. If you don't give enough money to your workers, then we're just going to replace you. But also, if you don't focus on profits enough, if you don't grow enough, then we're also going to replace you. And this is where the authoritarian government form really comes in. Because you can say that China is authoritarian, but by giving an example like this, you're making it very clear how this actually functions, and you can give a mechanism that basically enforces that, and it allows you to also very easily, like, whatever the debate's about, it allows you to very easily place your, the things you think will happen, and allows you to explain why that will happen, especially in China. And in Brazil, it says firms, but like I said before, if it's a government-owned corporation, of which you have a lot in, for example, in Brazil, why is another step we'll get to later, an additional step, then the government gets to decide, but in general, firms get to decide who runs the firms. Notice that in, for example, Brazil, it's a lot less common to have like shareholders, it's more common to have like family-run corporations with an entrenched elite, blah, blah, blah. Notice it. Trade policy is the next, so I'm going to talk a lot, and my jaw's already locking up a bit, but we'll be fine. Trade policy. So trade policy is about what kind of tariffs do you have? What are you saying on the national stage, the international stage? Like, how do you approach trade? Is trade something good, or is it something bad we should be protected for? And the United States is sort of like, it's kind of both. That's why it's underbalanced here. Because in general, America and the European Union and basically rich countries in general love saying they're pro-free trade, and then they apply protectionist tariffs on their own countries because you know they can get away with that. And Trump is a good example of that because he wants all of the benefits from trade, but then when, for example, China is out-competing the US in steel production, then Trump basically wants to push through protectionist policies to protect the steel from going inside the United States. Europe is similar. But what this trade policy is also about is like, how did these countries basically grow? And what you see in countries, specifically in the Netherlands and Germany, is that they've decided to really lean into the global trade system. They have an export focus. That means they have committed to, I want to specialize, I want to make a specific product, I want to become very good at it, and I want to sell a lot of that to other countries, and you know what, I'll just import everything I can produce. Makes a lot of sense. Staple products we actually import from other countries. Germany is the same, like they export a lot of cars, but they import like different goods, like phones from China. Same for Japan, same for China, definitely for China. Except the difference with the other countries is that because China has like such a strong government focus on economics, and such a strong incentive to basically keep its economy growing. It's about employment for China. It's about making better jobs. And it's the easiest way to basically reach a large group because China, most of the people in China didn't really have a lot of money. So it's kind of hard to sell products to people in China. So instead, you make iPhones and you sell them to the United States because they give you a lot more money. That's a really quick way to generate a lot of cash. But at the end of the day, it means your people are working for another country. You know, they're not making products for their own people. That's what net exporter means. It means that Germany, if you go away from the abstract of money and look towards actual products, it means most things in Germany, for example, if there's, there's a 10%, if Germany, okay, Netherlands is a 10% net exporter, right? It means that we export 10% more than we import. But that actually means that when you look on the economy as a whole, it means that if we make 10 cars, for example, then one of those cars is never going to be used by a Dutch person. It is being made for something else, for someone else. And in turn, you get like vague things like investments and currencies and all of these vague things. But they don't actually help that much because the Netherlands has actually run a trade surplus for the past 20 years. But we don't really have a huge international stock option because, you know, you get an economic crisis every once in the 10 years. And then you lose everything that you've built up in other countries. Or if another regime basically destabilizes, and if your government comes in place and basically declares everything you have null and void, then you could have made those 10 cars, so you could have made one car for a foreigner every year for 10 years. There's no value to it for you. So even though net exporter sounds really good, it's not actually that meaningful. So what Brazil's actually done, and a lot of developing countries like India did, for example, is the exact opposite. It's called import substitution. That's when you look at the economy and you see, oh, we're importing a lot of cars from Germany. We could be making our own cars. And then what they do is they set up a tariff barrier, so they make, for example, German cars twice as expensive, and then there's some room for domestic car producers to make their own cars. Now, the reason these cars weren't being sold in the first place is they're probably shittier than German cars. They're probably more expensive, they're probably less efficient. But now, at least you have like a car company that some people can work on. So it works for like national symbolism, but it doesn't really work to get like efficient goods going to your people. It's more of a thing for people to feel good about themselves, but it's not really good long-run policy. If you build your entire economy around having a car factory for your own people, then at some point you're probably going to want to open up your economy to other countries, and because you want to sell to them too. But then that also implies you have to open up to foreign cars coming to you. That means that if your company has not learned to compete with international corporations, it's still going to crash. You don't really have anything. It's like a fake way to promote growth. It doesn't really work in the long run. Then we get to the last bar, which is nominal support for free trade. So notice that the United States used to be high, but now with Trump it's low. Question?
It was just something to add, like a concrete example on the trade policies. If you look at the Asian miracle, and before like the 1980s, they all had this import substitution thing. They all protected their imports. And then they switched to exports focus, and then they grew like hell.
Yeah,
so
it takes like a mix between the two. Because, for example, Korea and Japan actually did develop through import substitution after a way, but they found a way to turn it around and to start specializing in a couple of products, and then they focused on export, on producing for export. So, for example, Korea, South Korea is the same. So then we have the European Union and Japan. They're both like pretty in favor of free trade on like the international scale. I mean, the European Union has like huge tariff barriers on a lot of products, but they still say that they really like free trade, and that's what this is all about. It's about nominal support. What are the countries saying? China used to be medium, but now that Trump has basically said, you know, we're going to have more protectionism, China notices it can get like political power by stepping into this vacuum, by getting like stepping into the hole that the United States used to fill, and they're becoming more in favor of free trade because it's a real easy way to like have a lot of people like you say, we'll provide you with we'll allow you to trade fairly with us. Look, the United States is putting up all of these tariff barriers against steel, and they're not allowing you to compete, but we'll allow you to compete. We'll fight for that. And then Brazil's somewhere in between because, you know, who really cares about Brazil on the international stage for free trade? They're not like a country that says major policy. So what are the implications? I already told you a bit about how political systems can really orchestrate this, right? If there's corruption, it's likely that you're going to have state-owned corporations. It's likely that you're going to want to have like a more protected, more shut-off form of economic growth because it favors those in power there. It basically perpetuates. And then China's unique because we have a lot of control, and trade policies affect the willingness to support free trade. So if you're very in favor of export focus, if you really want to export and specialize, you need other countries to basically decrease the tariff barriers so you can sell your cars to their populations as well. Whereas on the other hand, if you like really being able to have like your own car factory, you probably don't want like free trade everywhere. You want to be able to have some degree of control. So, are there any questions about what we just discussed? Awesome. WTO, IMF, and World Bank, what are they? These are three corporations. We're going to divide them into two groups. They're very scary, no shame, like knowing what the difference is, because you can basically bluff. So, what do they have in common? These are things you can always say. They're always going to be more or less true. They were set up by Western liberal democracies just after Second World War. They were set up to facilitate reconstruction. So we have like Europe that's fucked up, and they're like, oh, you know, we don't like that. Let's rebuild Europe. They wanted to streamline international trade to aid reconstruction. But you have to imagine, right, that Europe just fought a devastating world war. America just spent a lot of years investing. So America had like the Great Depression. They spent a lot of years investing in military factories, and now they don't need military factories anymore. Shit, we don't want another depression. We need to turn them around and make them into consumer products. So we need people to sell them to. So we need Europe to be able to repair itself as quickly as possible. So they also want to streamline trade so they can sell American products to the West. And they want to prevent the spread of communism. Because the idea is that if you have like a country that is fucked up beyond all recognition, FUBAR, it's very likely that communism is going to spring up here. So just after the Second World War, we had major communist movements in Italy, in Yugoslavia, which had already turned communist, even in France, for example. It was very realistic that communist forces were going to win elections democratically. No revolution, no violence, just going to win elections because that is what people wanted at that point in time.
Maybe a stupid question, why is everyone so scared of communism?
Well, because the people that control the United States are capitalists, and they have capital, and they don't like communism spreading because it's a threat to their own position of power, is one way you can frame it. Another way of framing it is that a lot of people on the ground have just spent years fighting the fascists. They deal with a lot of propaganda, so it's easy to extend that to communism. And mostly it's just a different form of government that people are afraid of, because it's like, oh, it's so different, oh, it's so scary. I'm not afraid of communism.
Also because the Soviet Union did it, and everyone's going to say, look at what the Soviet Union did, they killed so many people.
Yeah, I mean, they didn't know at that time, but yeah. Like, communism is scary. Mostly because the people in control of the media and stuff are also the people that have the most to lose from people like rising up and seizing the means of production. The WTO, IMF, and World Bank were not democratic in nature. They are not like the United Nations where people get to vote. They don't have any of these structures. They don't have any ways to like pass legislation. They work through consensus and through bureaucratic appointment, basically. I think I have, yeah, power through contribution. So the way that the United States has a lot of influence in the World Trade Organization and the World Bank and IMF specifically is because they pay most of the bills, because they supply most of the loans, because they provide most of the capital. Note that if China wants to like get more if China wants to contribute more and get more power, then they still favor the United States because of historical reasons, and because the United States can just say, okay, then we'll double our contribution. And at a certain point, you know, these organizations really don't need money anymore, so then they're likely to just stick with the United States. So there's pressure, you can put pressure on these institutions, but there's no harsh mechanisms. You can't vote anyone out of control, you can only like threaten to come out there from something like that. And because of this, they have significant Western influence. So recently, they've realized that, okay, maybe it's a good thing if we also allow some developing countries to say a couple words. Because in 2008, we had an economic crisis, the United States was going to hell, so was the European Union, and then the only countries that were still developing somewhat were the BRIC countries: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. And you know, that's a really easy point for them to say, okay, so if we're growing the most, then we're obviously doing something right, so we should get more influence in the World Trade Organization. What the World Trade Organization is, we'll talk about it in a minute. Now these countries have like collapsed to some degree, they're not growing as fast anymore, so this is shifting a bit back into a momentum favoring the West, but there's still more influence from developing countries now than there was before. So we're going to talk about the World Trade Organization first, right? It's based on 5 principles, and it's the basis of most international trade treaties that we see today. First off, you have non-discrimination, we have reciprocity, enforceable commitment, transparency, and safety values. And they basically manifest themselves into these couple of things. So this all doesn't really matter that much. Just try to like roughly get the idea of the sentiment that the WTO has. MFN stands for most favored nations. It means that if there's one nation, and if you have like trade barriers for steel, for example, and you have 20% for everyone, so if they want to sell something in your country, then 20% of that money is going to go into the pocket of that government, then you cannot deviate from that. You cannot say, okay, I'm Germany, I'm going to ask 20% from everyone, but for the Netherlands, you guys get 5%. The most favored nation clause basically prevents this. Everyone who's in the WTO needs to treat everyone like they treat their most favored nation. So if Germany treats the Netherlands better than it treats the rest of the world, then Germany must be forced to basically lower its tariff barriers so it's equal for all of those countries in the world. Reciprocity is basically that big countries cannot bully small countries. That if you lower your tariffs to someone, you kind of expect them to do the same.
Why do they set this rule for like the most favorable nation and not for the most unfavorable nations?
Because it doesn't really matter that much in practice, and because most treaties are most trade treaties are negotiated on the basis that we're going to lower tariffs. So like, okay, guys, we have 20% tariffs now. We want the Netherlands to lower theirs a bit, so we'll lower our bit. So that's like what the momentum is usually. The momentum is towards less trade barriers, not to more. Because if you want more trade barriers, you don't need to negotiate. You can just say, I'm going to put more trade barriers on you. And because you want someone else to lower when you're improving trade, that requires consistency. Good question. Then we get to enforceable commitment. That basically means you need stability. So if you make a trade treaty, you want another country to actually be able to like make good on its word, not to like flip-flop back and forth. And because we have like the big WTO and everyone wants everyone to be like stable, there's a lot of pressure to do so. We have transparency. Every country that makes a trade treaty and is a WTO member needs to report that to the WTO, so everyone knows what's up. You have checks and balances on one another. And then we get the safety values, which is basically that there's deviation under some circumstances. So the reason Trump can get away with, for example, increasing trade barriers on steel is because of anti-dumping measures. So what they say is, China's producing way too much steel. They're not producing it because they want to sell for profit. They're doing so because they want to disrupt American markets and want to disrupt American steel producers. So they say that China's making like 1 million bars of steel, not because they want to make profit, but because they just want to dump them on the American market and see like prices drop and then profits drop and in fact like companies go bankrupt. Because there's anti-dumping measures in the WTO, you are allowed to temporarily increase your tariffs under these circumstances, and then to basically block out these kind of things that happen. So you have like these safety values. Similarly, if a country like gets completely fucked up because of a climate, like a climate event or like a volcano, then you get like some leeway in setting up some different legislation than you normally have.
What is the reason behind Trump increasing his trade tariffs, trade barriers? Is that he wants to strong arm China into putting its support?
Yeah, that is very likely what's actually occurring. And that is why he says he's doing it because of anti-dumping. And I believe to some degree China is dumping.
So national interest is also
Yeah, but it's not a reason you can report to the WTO. To the WTO, Trump has to go and say, they're dumping. And it's really hard to like prove the intent behind China's dumping because it's like on a huge scale. So that's why they can get away with calling it dumping, even though it's not. So this is like a loophole these countries use.
Yeah, so one question about reciprocity, with your anything about it, maybe?
No, I did say,
Oh,
but
sorry.
it was just before I answered your question. So basically the idea is that Germany cannot say to the Netherlands, you're going to lower your barriers on tariffs by 10%, and then we're going to lower ours by 2.5% because we're big, and it's basically expecting you to do the same.
Yeah, so, what was I going to ask? Oh yeah, about the power of the WTO, how do they enforce?
Yeah, we're going to get to that later.
All right.
So, in theory, this all helps move over international growth, and so stimulates growth, right? So if everyone has like better trade barriers, it's love. So if everyone has like fewer trade barriers, if everything's stable, then we're going to get more trade. Whoop-de-fucking-do. That's the positive sides of the WTO. So what are the negative sides? How do they enforce things? So the WTO also handles dispute settlements. So this is where you begin. Claimants go to their member state. So a company in China that's doing business in Germany says to China, hey, you're treating us unfairly, please help us. Then China can go to WTO and raise a complaint. China's a member state. Actually, China is a member state. And then the WTO basically appoints 3 random people, 1 for each member state and 1 neutral arbiter, and they form an ad hoc panel. They have confidential negotiations that nobody can know about. They have a binding outcome that everyone has to treat as legally binding, that can force countries to change their law, and can force companies to be compensated by governments, and to even suspend members who basically refuse these things from the WTO and all of its protective services and whatnot. So that's a lot. Very powerful, very problematic, because you can basically overrule sovereign democratic decision making, and multinationals get like a tool they can use to exploit governments. An example of this is an energy company that set up business in Germany, near Berlin. It was called Wasserfall, I think. Doesn't really matter, you can just lie in debates, it's awesome. But it was called Wasserfall, let's just say, and it basically set up an energy plant, right? And it used like some river water to basically cool its systems to make sure everything kept running smoothly. I think it might have been a nuclear plant. Then Germany says, oh no, we don't like nuclear plants anymore, we want to legislate more, we want to have more regulations. And then because this company had recently set up, this Wasserfall went to, it was a company. Now Germany, you know, that's bad, but Germany has enough tax dollars to pay for it. But when you talk about countries like Peru, the relationship between these corporations and these governments is much more significant. And this has happened to developing countries. They have such a hard time like coughing up these millions of dollars in fines that they basically do whatever these corporations want before they can ever raise a complaint. They basically start catering to these corporations and they basically just do whatever they want because they can't risk not doing so. They have to stay in the WTO if they want to trade with most of the rest of the world, because otherwise they're ostracized and they basically don't get any of the protection from, for example, most favored nations clauses. North Korea is, for example, not in the WTO, so everyone can just put whatever tariffs they want on North Korea. And if you, as Peru, drop out, it means that suddenly the United States can put a lot of tariffs on your quinoa or whatever you're selling to the United States. So are there any questions on this so far? So you can see how the WTO, to some degree, actually does have it. But, okay, I think it's not in here, yeah. So the WTO actually does make decisions through consensus. So for any decision to pass, it basically needs unanimous support, because otherwise one country can just not ratify a treaty, and then nobody's helped, because, you know, you need to treat everyone like most favored nation. One country can just get away with it. So these negotiations take like decades. Some of them have taken like 2 or 3 decades almost for any agreement to be reached. And it's like a very long, slow process. I believe that to some degree the WTO really does help international trade. It really does, just like my personal belief, really does help international trade. It really does help like smooth things along from time to time. But the dispute settlement system is like very problematic. It's one of the reasons T.D.V was so opposed and CETA, because they wanted to propose like an additional dispute system that was going to be even worse. So like lots of things to weigh off, lots of sides you can take in the debate.
So yeah, on your dispute settlement thing, I think what's more common is that when, say, Brazil or say China, or say USA accuses China of dumping, for example, in WTO, there's dispute settlement, and now the World Trade Organization gives the USA an extra reason, or like leeway to give their own protectionist measures. This is what usually happens.
No, this is basically one of the outcomes, right? If your country basically, if China just keeps dumping on the US, after the US has raised a complaint, then the US can basically have these anti-dumping measures.
But this is very uncommon.
No, it's pretty common.
That this happens?
Yeah, it happens.
I thought just like...
It doesn't even matter for a debate, because if you can explain both these mechanisms...
Yeah, but like, it's very easy to explain why usually WTO won't let it get that far, and will usually go for the safer option, which is letting people fight back through their own...
Yeah, but that's not a safer option, because it destabilizes the principles that the WTO was built on. It basically has a lot of ramifications for the rest, whereas this is a pretty easy system where you can like slide off a complaint and basically just have it be dealt with behind closed doors. This is confidential negotiation.
Why is people?
These are like lawyers, experts, trade experts. So there's a lot of ways you can basically like see how corruption and like white people can dominate the world trade and stuff, right? Yeah, awesome. So the second group is the World Bank and the IMF, because they're very similar. They work together, and you know they're pretty much synonyms in the debates world. So that's good. They're closely related. They help countries restructure and deal with their debt, and they can force policy reforms on countries to do so. These policy reforms are often focused on austerity. They used to be rarely tailored to like specific countries, because you have like a white expert from the WTO, or sorry, from the IMF and World Bank fly in from, for example, the Netherlands to help Suriname deal with its, you know what I'm talking about, right? Yeah. Yep. Yeah. They have like experts flown in that don't really know a lot, that haven't had like a lot of education, don't really know a lot about these specific countries. So I'm telling you this because this is often something that the debates there's like uncertainty about, like what do these reforms look like? If you can explain that these are like people that have had PhDs in economics, and most of these people come from the West and work for, like most people that work for the IMF are from the West, you can make it more believable that these policies are not going to be like tailored to these specific countries, even if these people want it. And because of this, they can cause recurrent debt. They can cause countries to basically never get out of debt and to just keep paying more, and then they're basically dependent on the IMF completely. Why? We'll talk about it in a second. It's often the only way out for those who accept. Greece didn't have another option when it accepted, and Chile didn't have another option, and I could just give you 20 different country names, but you know, you'll just believe me when I say something. So the alternative could be way worse. The reason these countries accept is because defaulting on the debt, and basically letting their economy slide further and not getting this help for restructuring loans to deal with the debt, is even worse. And the abstract of strict regulation may prevent loans from being provided. So if you, as an investor, okay, so how do countries actually get money? They give out government bonds. They say, here's some money, here's a piece of paper that says that over 20 years' time, we will pay you back a little bit of money. But if people don't believe that you're ever going to be able to pay back the money, which is what happened to Greece, for example, the interest rate that the Greek government has to pay on these bonds increases exponentially. So that means that instead of, so for example, right now, the Netherlands can borrow for almost 0% interest rate because money is very cheap and because nobody believes that the Dutch government is actually at risk at all. But for Greece, for example, the worst one, it had to pay like 20% interest rate per year, which means that borrowing money becomes more expensive, but they also need to pay back more, and they also need to keep their economy running, so they get into like a spiral that keeps getting worse and worse. So with I say, they might not be getting any loans whatsoever because nobody trusts them to actually get their shit together. This is a trust mechanism. Oh, okay. I thought I had another slide on this, but yeah.
Does the IMF also kind of fund these dealing with debts? Do they actually give money to governments?
So they give loans, and they always need to be paid back. So the IMF cares about getting its money paid back, so it's likely to want to really enforce this austerity.
And why is it more beneficial to take a loan from the IMF than to take a loan from another country, for example?
Because the IMF still gives you like, so the reason the IMF can do this is because they can say, yeah, you'll just have to reform some policies, you'll just have to pass these through, but you'll have to pay less interest rate. It will help you. That's like what restructuring loans is basically when you take out new loans that are cheaper to pay older loans. So you had like a loan with a 20% interest rate, and then you start borrowing at 10% to pay back that loan. That's how restructuring works. That's what the IMF does.
Oh yeah, so one more comment on like can cost recurring debt was actually sometimes relevant in debates, and just one question about the alternative to the World Bank, the Asian alternative to the World Bank. So like, can cost recurring debt, what's happened in Africa and other developing countries like Indonesia is that one of the,
It's not in Africa.
and I said and, it's not it.
Yeah, it's fine.
No, but like they say in the agreements, you're going to have to like privatize certain parts of your mineral reserves. What happens then is that huge European companies can buy in those lease contracts for these minerals in those countries for many years, and then that money gets funneled through Europe and not through its own governments anymore.
Yeah.
That's one of the things that really creates that recurring debt in those nations.
Yeah, it's
That's
another
intentional.
example as well.
And just one more question
That's
about
just my person. You can.
Okay, so maybe again, who kind of runs the World Bank? How do they make their decisions? And
Same.
also, it's the same thing.
Yeah,
as
that was the
other
common
thing.
part of it.
Right, that was the common part. Okay, and then so their conditions are just pretty much wholly financial and stuff like that.
I'm gonna
Right?
give
They
you an
can't say
example.
like you need to have democracy or something. I don't know.
So they usually find a way to shoehorn in democracy there as well. But in principle, it's only financial ways. But you know, United States is the backer, and if there's a United States politician in the White House that basically wants to look like they're forcing democracy in everyone, yeah, we'll try to do it.
So the Chinese set up an alternative investment bank because they feel like the World Bank, the IMF, too Western oriented. It's like the International Investment Agency.
Infrastructure.
Yeah,
Yeah.
the Asian Infrastructure Bank, which is
Yeah.
part of, still part of this World Bank, I think. It still works together.
Actually, but how relevant is it as an act?
However relevant you want to make it in a debate.
Yeah.
Like that's really what this is all about. It's very scary, all of these things, but you should just learn to bluff because nobody knows. If you can explain why it's relevant, and even if someone claims and is right in claiming it's not, then you're still going to take it over them because you provide a more believable explanation. That is what this entire workshop is about. If you don't understand why this is relevant for debate, always just raise your hand and ask me why is this relevant to the debate and explain it. So another example of how this recurring debt occurs is Greece, because Greece is just a textbook example of how it happens. So Greece had an economy that was like 70% funded by the government. So 70% of people worked in the government or worked for a corporation that did things for the government, and it was just a lot of money being taxed by the government and then flowing to other things. Like the government played a major role in that economy. So when they crashed, they had a lot of expenses. They didn't really have that much income anymore, they had a lot of expenses. So what happens? The World Bank, or actually the IMF and European Central Bank, you can forget that last one now, step in and they tell them, you need to start saving some money. You need to fire some teachers, you need to free some hospitals, and you need to basically start making sure that you can pay the people you actually do have. So what happens? Greece does fire teachers, does close hospitals, which is like really bad in itself, but that also means that suddenly Greece doesn't have the income from these people anymore. They don't get tax money anymore from the people that used to work in these hospitals. And the shops that were around these hospitals, around these schools, no longer have teachers that are buying products there. So because the government was so big, the knock-on effects of saving money as a government were huge. So Greece actually shrunk its national economy by, I think, like 20 or 30%, which is a ridiculous amount a ridiculous amount to fall back. It's like the same as 40 years of like normal growth. And they lost that in like 2 or 3 years. And now they still have to pay back their own loans. They still have like the size of their debt remained the same, at least, but now they didn't have as much income anymore. So and because they didn't get as much income, they only saved like a marginal fraction of the money they actually were no longer spending. So let's say that instead of they were receiving 100 before, they were spending like 120, but now they were only receiving 50, and they were still spending like 65. So that means that they were spending 20 too much before. Now we're still spending 15 too much. Except there's a lot of people that are unemployed and like spread on the ground and like squirming and dying. It's very bad and like painful. Notice furthermore that the way these bonds work is that there's all of these like credit agencies that basically look at how big is your debt compared to your GDP. So even if they manage to like pay off 20% of their debt, if they also lose 20% of their GDP, the ratio is going to be the same. They still need to pay the same amount of interest rates. So they don't actually save any money dynamically either because their interest payments are too high. So that means that you have these governments that are now spending, that used to have money to spend on teachers and on hospitals, are now just spending it to pay back foreign creditors. That is why defaulting all your debt as a country is actually pretty tempting, because you can just say, yeah, we're not going to be able to pay back. We need to be able to like step up as a country and like build up from the ground again. Please fuck off. It's actually not that bad a step to take, because that is one of the alternatives for these countries, to just say, we're not going to be able to pay this debt ever. Sorry, all of our foreign relations. Sorry, foreign corporations. We're not going to be able to pay. So that means that foreign corporations, that everyone's very unlikely to want to loan you in the future, right? You're very unlikely to borrow, and foreign corporations are going to be very afraid to basically set up shop in your country, but it might still be worth it. Behind you.
Why didn't Greece do this? Why didn't Greece?
Because it's scary. And because Greece specifically is a part of the euro, which we'll get to later, so it was pressured by a lot of other countries, and it got a better deal than it would have had if it not been part of the euro.
Yeah. Who's behind this bank? It seems that it's really self-centered.
White bureaucrats from
Yeah,
America.
but somebody should have pooled those resources that they're lending to countries in need.
Yeah, the United States and the West. But this doesn't need to be the case, and you can frame this to be differently inside the debate, depending on which side of this debate you're on, because here's what I said before, where I said these banks and stuff are becoming more and more focused on developing countries. I don't know where it was. Can go over here. You can basically use that in your advantage to say, yeah, the trend is that it's going to be more fair, the trend is that it's going to go that way. Use these different things to weigh off in the debate, because all of these debates are all about framing, because most of the judges don't know any of the things I just told you. So if you can make it believable, then just make sure it fits whatever framing is on your side of the debate, and use that to basically win. That is how you win these debates, but just fucking bullshitting your way through. That is what Dan Milling does, because he doesn't know shit about economics. He doesn't know it. I mean, he probably knows a bit, but he doesn't know that much. You can beat him if you have a better framing and you have a more believable framing. It's not about knowing, it's about explaining why that's the case. Whew. I'm sorry if I'm just like cutting short sometimes. This is like a lot to go through, and it's physically painful to do so because how much I have to talk.
Very good. Want some water?
No, I have some. So this is a quick practice motion I'm going to talk about. This is from Leiden Open. This house supports BRICS countries creating alternatives to the current international economic institutions, i.e. the IMF, the World Bank, and the World Trade Organization, WTO. BRICS is Russia and Brazil. Yeah, we discussed this before. So, what do you guys think? What's the first thing that springs to mind?
Western bureaucrats are currently running the show who are influenced by, I'm sure, Western thought.
And I'm sure you would say this if you were on team?
Opposition. From opposition.
Yes. Yes. Proposition. And then opposition would say,
Fuck these bitches.
no. Big Mike, you know.
Huh?
What would you say is the opposite? If this is a claim that's brought by government, how would you respond to
So,
opposition?
what was she claiming again? It was like Western bureaucrats and
White
stuff
people
like that,
around
right?
the world.
Yeah, I literally don't care. They have the power in the world. Probably future relations are way better. Also, these countries, as we saw, are collapsing, not doing that strong. They also have political tensions within them. I don't know why they're reliable.
But why is that specifically related to this motion? So what is the implication when you say these are run by white bureaucrats?
Implication is unfair for the rest of the world that they get a.
But why is it unfair? What's the unfairness?
The unfairness is that if any rulings are to be made, they are most often made in favor for Western
Exactly.
countries.
So they favor Westerners over other countries. So what you need to bring up against that is either what I told you before. These institutions are becoming more and more focused on developing countries, and you can like make it sound a bit better than it is today. like
But that weakens only this case. How would you?
that's opposition. That's what I'm saying. Mitigation
I know.
is very underrated.
Mitigation, yeah, I know, but
This debate, when I was there, was like I talked about this when Fenna was in the room. I gave this workshop to Fenna. Fenna was actually one of my judges, and she made me second, and I was very pissed because that was bullshit. But because it was bullshit, not because
You still broke.
yeah, so I should have won. And closed opposition, I was opening government. Closing opposition was they didn't want to engage with our material at all, which is why I think we should have won because we have better material. But whatever. But opening opposition basically ran. Yeah, but the China and all of these BRICS countries don't have the money to set up one of these new corporations, and they're basically going to piss. If you want to join one of these new institutions, you're basically going to piss off the West. You're not going to be able to trade with them. Blah 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 blah. So let's tackle all of these one by one, right? First off, these BRICS countries don't have the money to basically do so. Okay, remember that I told you that China has a lot of control over different corporations. Remember? Okay, so it also has control over the banks. So whereas the United States needs to actually pay for most of its loans, it needs to actually get them on the free market, China can just demand money. So it's very easy for China to mobilize its resources, even though it has a few resources in general. But because it has such a great control over its economy, it can more easily like shift the flow and whatnot. So it's probably pretty, you can probably make it pretty believable as a government that China will still have the resources required to set this up, and if not, then the rest of those countries can also help them do so. Secondly, what was the second thing I said? Yeah, you're going to piss off the West by joining this. Okay, so notice that the major difference between the West and these BRIC countries is that the West have like more or less free economies, which means that Western governments don't really have as much control over what their economic agents do, whereas the East does. What this means is that you could probably join, so if you really have to choose between the West and the East, right? You can do either one or the other. And you choose the West. And it's very possible that China can order its companies to stop buying from your country. That it can raise tariffs, and that it can basically fuck you over. And that you'll still have trade with the West, but East will be completely cut off. If you trade with the East, it's a lot harder for the United States to basically control its companies, because its companies just go wherever they make profit. So if they smell profit by dealing with you and by deviating from what the United States government tells them to, they're very likely to still do so. That means you can pick the East, you can join these new institutes, and you can still trade with the West and still have some of those benefits because they have less control and they are democratic nations and they can't just force their
I don't get that.
citizens to do so.
It's going a bit too fast. Okay, say it again. Like,
What did you
that's
do?
the last part about how companies can decide, and it's China but not in the United States.
Yeah, so what do you think I'm saying? What did you get?
Not much to be honest.
Yeah, well, just say what you did, yeah, because I know you got something.
Just
I know, I need, like, just please repeat, because then I know what I need to say.
Right, so China and many other Eastern countries have a lot of control over their resources because they are government controlled. Therefore, they can decide where they don't need these external parties to
No,
introduce on there.
so what I'm saying is that you can piss off the West, that doesn't mean the West can do anything. You can piss off the East, and the East can definitely do something. Because in the East, we have companies that are appointed, that have like people that are appointed by the government, that are run by the government, that are owned by the government. So if you piss off the government, you piss off the companies. The West is like a lot more deviation there because companies are owned by private individuals that just chase profit. So you can't force these companies to do anything. You could maybe like set up some tariff barriers and like maybe make it harder for them, but it's a lot clunkier and you have a lot less degree of control. So you can afford to piss off the West. You can't really afford to piss off the East. If you have to choose the East because you can always profit from the West a bit as well. Yeah? Okay.
So from which side would you support it then? Because you would support it as an Eastern nation or something.
No, you need to frame this. You need to, that's what we, okay, you weren't here in the beginning. So we were talking about this, right? Here we go. Economics debates are about the size of the pie and how it gets cut up. How it gets cut up. So I think that if we would only have these Western institutions, then world trade as a whole would probably be better. And we interact more and the world pie would probably be bigger. Joost, don't look so angry at me. just having a single set of government, just having a single WTO is probably more efficient because everyone's like using the same rules. Everyone basically subscribes to the same system, and there's no fighting between these companies and between these two institutes about who's better. But this is an income division that's more skewed towards the West because of these things we discussed before. These are like white bureaucrats that favor Western nations over Eastern nations. So then is the way off. Who do we think are more important? Do we think it's more important that the pie is bigger, or that like developing nations get a fairer chance at catching up with the West, and, like have a better division in doing so?
By saying that those institutions lean toward the West, are we speaking in facts or in frames?
Frames,
Okay.
but also facts. Like it's in favor, but not as much in favor
And you will, yeah.
as you think. Yeah. But they are like more in favor of the West than they are of the East. But like the East and West is like a super generic like division that doesn't really exist in that way anyway, because only China really has the amount of control that we've been discussing that so far. But they are so big that they make a very big statement here.
So the goal in this debate, sorry.
Yeah, no, sir.
And the goal in this debate is then to create a bigger pie, is what you're saying? Or the goal
Depends on which side you're on. So if you're on the opposition, if you're on the government side, you're probably going to talk about the division, right? That it's better for developing countries if they have a developing country inside one of these institutes that can help them so they can develop, and we care more about them than the people that are already rich. Whereas on the other side, we say, okay, but if everyone's richer, then it's easier for us to basically send resources to these countries and to help them develop and make sure they can sell to the West so they can grow. Another thing that happens here is that these Western bureaucrats, for example, don't really know what you need in a developing country, whereas China has recently grown, and has recently grown very fast, and probably knows more what it's like to be one of these developing countries to grow, so they have more relevant expertise. So these institutes might actually be better, just factually, and better at like giving better advice to these developing countries than other institutes.
Can you, like, is it an angle to talk about, like, ideologically what this will do to spreading, say, more China-based political systems?
Definitely. That's some extension stuff. Yeah. I think we discussed that in IR.
Yeah, but just like
about like the different models of government.
Yeah,
You can definitely tie that in here. Yeah. I think you were there.
Yes, I was
You
there.
were. So who wasn't there? You were. So I just talked a bit about like if you trade a lot with a country, if you cooperate, if they give you a lot of money, then you're likely to like lean into their system and to start following them. And if you, in an extended team, for example, closing opposition here, where you're against this, you could basically run, okay, we prefer to have these developing countries earn a bit less, but to have more exposure to like Western models of government that value democracy and like individuality over these authoritarian communist systems that basically force these minorities to basically succumb to whatever the majority wants. Yeah.
So are then economic systems inherently linked to political systems?
No, but in the current status quo, they generally tend to be, because we already discussed, like, for example, the corruption, right? The same happens in China, like, because the government has so much power in controlling who's in different corporations, it's in everyone's interest that it continues to do so. If you're someone who can decide who becomes the next CEO, that gives you a lot of power, so you don't want to give that away. And if you're likely to become, if you're in the elite, you're likely to become a CEO, you want to keep that system there. So there is a lot of correlation and some causation, but you don't need to have both.
Yeah, just to say, if you weren't at the IR workshop, the slides are on the case file thingy that's in the Facebook group.
Did you
So-
film it?
Huh? I tried to film it, then I press stop, and then it says, well, nope, and then
Yeah.
it was gone.
Okay. I need a group. So why do we have different currencies?
Gulden.
Prior to 2002, you had the Dirk members.
Dear conventional.
Prior to 2002, we had many, I'm just going to get a carrot. We had many different currencies in Europe, and I need to press my slides.
For
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what does that mean? That means we have exchange rates. So what are exchange rates? They're relative values of currency. So recognize that, for example, recognize that yen in Japan is 100 to 1 euro, more or less. So does it mean it's worth 100 times as much? Can you buy 100 times as many things with it? No. Just means that it has a different nominal value and that there's a relation happen because the government prints more money. So there's a bigger supply, there's an equal demand, your money becomes worthless. So relative supply goes up, value goes down. Now, exchange rates are interesting though, because you use them to buy other products. So if a euro becomes cheaper, it means that any product that is sold in an equivalent amount of euros, and that nominal value doesn't change, then becomes cheaper. If German cars are always sold for 10,000 euros, and suddenly euros become cheaper to buy when you have dollars, that means that German cars become cheaper. It means that you can export more, you can grow your economy by devaluing your currency, by printing more money, and by making your currency worth less on the international level. Do we understand this? Good.
No? You think it was-
Yeah, you can ask.
Kind of fast.
Just make a numerical example.
No, I don't think that helps. So the opposite also applies. If you start printing more money and euros become worthless, and you also need more euros to buy a yen, for example, or 100 yen, it also means that all of the products you were buying from Japan have now become more expensive. That is why it's very cheap to go on vacation. That's why it was very cheap to go on vacation in the United States just after the economic crisis, because nobody wanted to buy dollars anymore. So anyone who did buy dollars could get a lot of dollars for €1. Means you can buy a lot of American hotel nights, you can buy a lot of American hamburgers while you're there. You can basically get the vacation on the cheap.
Yeah, but if a product gets cheaper as a direct result of the devaluation, what's the word? Devaluation of the currency, there's going to be increasing production of that product, and at some point in time, it's going to harmonize the price.
Yeah, in the long run, you can print more money today, but that doesn't mean your money's going to be worth less in 100 years. It always normalizes because these prices always slide back. Generally, these countries keep printing more money when they devalue. So that means that when China's been doing this for like 20 years, devaluing its currency relative to the US dollar so they can export more. But they need to keep doing so over time. They need to keep buying US dollars to keep their, to make sure that everyone wants to buy US dollars, so they buy a lot of them. So then other people have to pay more when they want to buy them because there's a lot of demand. And that basically means that they need to print more money to keep doing so. It becomes more and more expensive because the money becomes worth less and less and less. So it's really hard to keep doing this for a long time.
So this is basically about the like fluctuation of purchasing power. Is that like the right thing?
This is purchasing power.
Okay.
How many foreign goods can I buy with money?
Yeah, so then also a related concept would be hyperinflation, right? If you print more currency, then you have hyperinflation. I thought that was a thing that they did in Africa, or is that?
So if you
something
print
else?
more, you get inflation.
Yeah.
Countries have been printing more money to devalue their currencies for like centuries. It's fine. If you reach a certain critical value, people start working differently. So, for example, if the government's like, oh, we'll just print twice as much money as we already have, and then we'll be like it'll be super cheap. It'll be worth half as much, and people can buy like twice as much if they're a foreigner. But think how you would respond. If prices have been increasing every day, or like every month by 10%, would you still be happy with your old salary? No, right? You'd probably go to your boss and say, look, products are going to be 10% more expensive next month. I need 10% more money, right? And then different mechanisms start playing on that inflation. Because in reality, inflation is just, inflation happens naturally in every country in the world. If everyone has the same inflation rate, then these currencies are worth the same. It doesn't really matter. Prices generally do tend to go up. When they reach a critical mass and they go up too much in a short amount of time, people start expecting them to go up really shortly. And that's when these mechanisms come into play. So if the baker knows that everything else is going to be 10% more expensive next month, then he's also going to make his products 10% more expensive because he needs to buy product for 10% more, right? And then someone else thinks, yeah, but what if it's 15%? I need to raise my prices by 15. And next month it becomes 15% more expensive. 20, 30, 40, 100, a million, because that's really how hyperinflation works. You can go from having 100, you can buy a hamburger with 100 yen in 1 year, then the next year it's like a million. And that is how we get to Zimbabwean dollars, which are printed in like the billions right now. And it's just started like striking off the zeros. You just said like everything's worth a million less now because we don't have room on the bills anymore.
Can you undo this by like stop printing money or something?
What they did in Zimbabwe is they just said, I'm just gonna only accept US dollars now.
Yeah.
Which works, but it also means you no longer have any control over monetary policy because Zimbabwe in the long run can't decide to like print more money to like have some, they can't like just do it a little bit. They can't do it at all anymore. If they ever do try to set up their currency, it's going to be very hard to become believable. And you also become, like, if you want to be like the colonialist extension, you can also, that means that Zimbabwe is now 100% dependent on the United States monetary policy, and they have to follow whatever the United States does because they have no control, and the United States is going to use it to fuck them over, which they do.
Or we can just use the Western Bank to take a loan and turn it into subsidies for those that.
Yeah, but if you start subsidizing, then people get more money, so people can ask more money from them, so they can raise prices more. It's just going to make it worse and worse and worse and worse.
If
There's
your
really
currency
no
dies, if that happens nowadays, your currency dies. If it's hyper.
Yeah, that's what I just said. So your currency dies and you start switching to dollars, but there's all kinds of nasty things associated with that because people still don't really want to use Zimbabwean dollars, even though it hasn't really inflated anymore. It's still at its old value, but because of this reputation it has, nobody really wants to buy it because they're afraid it might happen.
Could you switch back? You could switch back. You have like a new brand name.
Yeah, exactly. So you can try to shed the old reputation. I'm just saying it's very hard.
Yeah.
That's what
you
you
just get a golden coin.
Okay. So note that, why do governments do this? Because if you have more exports and importing is harder for people on the street, you're more likely to buy your own products. Foreigners are more likely to buy it and your own people are more likely to buy it. So you get more employment. Short-term solutions doesn't really help you. Exchange rates, now this is where we get into more macroeconomics, also mitigate amplitudes of the business cycle. What does this mean? It means that if you have a flexible exchange rate, and for example, the Dutch, okay, so let's have, for example, the Netherlands, right? And suddenly we lose 50% of the demand for our products. Like everyone in the Netherlands becomes 50% poor. And it means that we can't buy as many products as we used to. We can only buy half as many because the prices are the same. And prices tend to be sticky, they don't really deviate. So what does that mean for other countries? They can suddenly see, oh, hello, Netherlands is super cheap. And it also means that because Dutch people are like 50% poorer, we also can't import as many products. So because, you know, we can buy them on the cheap. We can just buy guilders. They're still the same price in guilders, but I can buy twice as many guilders. So they start buying a lot of Dutch products. So for the Netherlands, that suddenly means that instead of like production dropping by 50%, it drops by like 10% or 20% because more foreigners come in and buy their goods instead. So instead of like suddenly shooting to 50% unemployment, we shoot to like 20 or 10% unemployment, which is really good for people like in general. When you're talking about unemployment as like your harm and your impact in the debate, talk what it's about. It's not just a number. I really love talking about this because it's very easy to get points with this. But first off, some people lose their job. You can always nuance this by saying most countries in the world don't really have a social security net. Even those that do, it's not very nice to be in there. So those people are fucked over. And if it's like in China, they're completely fucked over. You can make this people. Secondly, everyone in the economy is going to fear that they might lose their job, which is a psychological harm you cannot escape from because it hits everyone. So you can basically explain how national happiness decreases as a result of this. It has knock-on effects that basically hit everyone. You're afraid that your dad might lose their job, your dad's afraid that they might lose their job, even if they're very stable. Because even if, for example, they might not get fired, they might be afraid that their companies goes bankrupt, that their company they work at goes bankrupt, they lose their job anyway. So there's like a lot of ways that this has a big effect. Yeah. So, some more stuff. Why are exchange currencies bad? Why is exchange currencies bad? Okay. So they add cost, right? I don't know if you've ever been to an exchange office, but you never get the same amount you buy as when you sell a currency, because they make money off of buying and selling currencies. Because they need to have both of them on hand. They can't buy products with them. So you're paying them for the compensation for like having the money on hand. There's physical transaction costs because I need to go to an actual exchange office to buy money, or if I'm in like Hong Kong for a semester, and for some fucking reason I need to pay all of my rent in cash, I need to go to an ATM and like withdraw 500 euros worth of Hong Kong dollars every time. That's a physical cost, which is also affects like how much I'm going to trade, etc. And there's a risk involved. If I'm a Dutch company that, for example, sells cars to a US company, then the US company and the Dutch company need to decide, are we going to sign our contract in a euro value or in a dollar value? And those two will fluctuate. Because if 100 euros suddenly becomes worth as much, if 100 euros is worth as much as $100, and we sign a contract, and then for some reason dollars lose half their value, and suddenly you get $200 for 100 euros, it really matters if the contract is signed in one or the other. If it's signed in 100 euros, then that means that, oh shoot, I still need to pay as many euros. I'm not gaining anything. And the US company suddenly still gets $200, so that's good for them. But if it's in dollars, that means that I, as a Dutch company, suddenly only need to pay 50 euros. Because the contract isn't $100. I can now buy $200 for 100 euros. So I can also buy $100 for 50 euros. So it becomes cheaper to buy it. So there's a lot of risk involved. So how do these companies basically deal with this? They go to big insurance companies and they say, I want to buy an insurance policy against this. So it adds like costs like that. Do we understand that? It's like really hard mechanisms to explain, but just the sentiment of the idea is what matters.
Why are monetary transaction costs necessary? Why can't we just all say, okay, we'll stop with these transaction costs?
So imagine you're like the exchange, imagine you're the exchange company, right? So you have 100 euros and $100, and your job, the way you make money, is by selling them and then buying them from one another. So if you use your 100 euros to buy groceries, can you still use them to sell to someone who wants to buy euros? No, because you use it to buy groceries. Now you have groceries, nobody wants to buy those from you, you have a grocery store. So there's an opportunity cost when you're one of these corporations. And because of that opportunity cost, you want to be compensated. So you want to get like a little bit of steady income so I can still buy groceries with that steady income, and then I can use the money to basically transact one way or another. So even if you would have like a big government that said, okay, we're gonna, like a world government that said, we're gonna have all of these currencies you can trade for free, then it would still be a loss of economic value because the money needs to come from somewhere. And instead of it being used to buy groceries or not, it's sitting on a reserve somewhere so someone can buy it if they may want to buy it. By making this bigger, yes, you can decrease transaction costs. You can make it cheaper because there's now one big entity, so and everyone goes there, so you don't need to have like as big a reserve because it's very, you can expect people to come every day. So if you're in a major city, it's probably cheaper than if you're in a small country. So that is also why it's more expensive to, for example, buy yen in the Netherlands than it is to buy Polish zloty or Hungarian forint, because they're closer by, people are more likely to buy them, people buy them more frequently, so the opportunity cost for having them in your reserve is smaller. And there's also a cultural transaction cost. If I look up if I want to buy a product from a Hungarian website and it's in like forint, then I'm like, what is this? I'm not gonna buy this. This is weird. This is different. It basically makes the products from other countries less attractive. It's like a cultural cost. You're less likely to track them. You also don't feel as unified. I feel more unified with Germany because we have the same currency and I can spend euros there, than because if I go to Hungary and I need to go to a fucking exchange office, I need to switch money there because apparently my money's not good enough for it. It creates more barriers between people.
But how does that work then? Because then, for example, if you're buying online, that's kind of the same thing as doing it in real life, right? You can just look up the exchange rate and see, it's cheaper. And like, how does
So
that
is it
culture
as
work?
easy to look up the exchange rate or to just buy in euros?
Yeah, it's just Google.
No, because you need to Google something first. You need to put in more effort, right? And it's about the way people think.
Cost, right?
It's one of the reasons we have the euro is because there was a cultural cost. And because the euro is a political product, which was a political project, which we'll get to later, basically enforce that. So it's also an easy way to prevent reform, right? Because I talked about printing your own money before, and now you can make like your exports cheaper. So let's say that you're France and you have a lot of unemployment. Then do you want to make it easier? Do you want to like go through all of the hard effort because people are basically not working hard enough? You want to tell them, like, you as a politician, you want to tell them you need to start working harder, you need to start doing more, you need to start changing the ways you work so you become more productive? Or do you just decide to print more money and make your products cheaper? Most of these sovereign European countries did this for like 20, 30 years. France, every 10 years would say, okay, we're going to devalue our currency a bit more so we can stay competitive on the international market. Germany and the Netherlands, for example, invested in technology, invested in production techniques, so they could basically keep up with that. But France and Italy and Spain decided, okay, we're just going to take the easy way out. So it's a really easy way out to prevent reform, which is shitty. So you don't cut wages, you just print more money. So after 2001, we had one currency. We didn't have any more exchange rate. So we had lower transaction costs because you can just buy German products with euros now. You don't need to go to the office. You don't need to calculate anything. You can just like pay and it's fine. Awesome. And in theory, the European Union is an optimal currency area. So what goes in there basically means you mitigate the business cycle because there's labor mobility. So if suddenly, if suddenly there's like and there's risk sharing. So let's say that we have country A and country B, and there's a 50% chance that either of them is going to be hit by like a storm next year. Nice if everyone is in a crisis at the same time, and we need that at the same time. But is that the case? We're going to get to that in a moment. Also, there's less risk. We were talking about risk before, so it's more likely that you're going to have trade. So you get a bigger economy, you get happier people, because this is again one of those things where people really like stability, right? So we have a bigger economy, that's one way people become happier, because there's less risk, there's a bigger economy, people are happier. But a direct channel is just there's less risk, people are happier, because people have ease and peace of mind. They don't need to think about it. So do we have a currency area? No, no we don't. It's very bad. Euro is a political tool to help Europe grow closer. It's not really based on economic theory at all. It's way too big. Germany and the Netherlands, or Greece and the Netherlands, have nothing in common. There's nothing linking our economy to theirs, but we're in the same currency area and need to deal with the same shit now. Labor isn't mobile because nobody moved from Greece to Germany after the crisis. Greece was like collapsing in on itself. Germany was doing fine. Greek people could have moved to Germany freely because that's what the European Union provides you with, but because of language barriers, actually because of cultural barriers, because of language barriers, and also different regulations, people don't do so. So what is different regulations? If you're a Dutch citizen and you work in the Netherlands, you build Dutch pensions. But if you move to another country, you no longer build these Dutch pension systems. You need to find out, like, what is the German system? What is the Greek system? How am I going to find, like, an alternative system for this? It's very hard to do. It basically makes you very unlikely to actually move. Risk sharing is absent because nobody wants to transfer money to another area when they're rich. And everyone wants to get it when they're, like, poor, but it doesn't really happen. And it even used to be forbidden because people were afraid that people were just like, people in Germany were afraid that Greece was just going to not try at all and just extract money whenever they collapsed. And look, it actually happened. So it used to be forbidden, but it didn't actually work. And there's a vastly different cycle. So what we see now is that like the Mediterranean countries in the European Union aren't really doing very well, but Germany is. So then when the European Central Bank comes in and they say, yeah, we're going to print more money so we can export more cheaply, then Germany and the Netherlands really don't want that, and the South really wants it, but we can only choose one policy. We can only do it for everyone or do it for no one. So that means you basically lose monetary policy as an effective tool.
Just a question from an interest. So you say it's a bit too big, that's logical, but it's very different types of countries and cultures and whatever. However, if you put in place, for example, a Mediterranean group, a North European group, a Scandinavian group, and an East European group, just saying something, right? So, but a bit more similar, all these things, you would not necessarily be better off, maybe on an economic scale, right? But not on a how you compete with each other.
If it were my choice, I would 100% split up the EU.
But
there's no
the EU. Well, let's talk about Europe for now, I guess, because.
What? They're the
Euro.
same in this context.
Sorry?
The EU and Europe are the same in this context.
And the euro, like, I mean,
Yeah.
I'm talking about monetary groups, I guess, with the same coin. Or even the European Union, I don't really care, but what I'm saying is you would get huge competitiveness, I guess.
How?
I mean,
How would this work? So what
make this more equal in a sense over time anyway.
Yeah, it's like a long-run investment, but I think you can have one Europe and different euros. You can still have like a European Parliament and then have like 3 different euros, like layers, if you will. So if it were up to me, we'd probably have like Northwestern Europe, Eastern Europe, and like Mediterranean Europe or something like that. So you can have like a bit of both, but yeah, there's definitely costs associated to it. That's why people were able to basically enforce the euro on everyone, even though it's not necessarily the most optimal economic policy.
So it's better than being alone, you say, than before 2002?
But you can still have free trade without the euro.
Yeah.
It's just not going to be as free because there's these transaction costs. It's going to be harder to trade. It's going to be harder to buy like Spanish chorizo.
Oh, yeah. Chorizo. Pesos.
Maybe this is because I never experienced the euro, but how big are these harms? Because I can still go to the shops every day and buy my food with euros. And
Yeah.
I also like the fact that I can go to Germany and buy cheaper groceries there with the same coin.
Yeah, so
So how
we're
big are
very
these
rich, but people in Southern Europe generally aren't. So you can basically make a case for all of these effects amplifying for their populations. Because for them, it really is about having a job or not having a job. And Greece, for example, got fucked over so badly because the euro is like worth a lot. It's very valuable because, for example, after the economic crisis, we had Obama in the White House. He wanted like the fiscal easing policy, and he basically said we're going to print a shit ton of money. I mean, he didn't. The independent central bank of the United States did it, but you know he did it. So the dollar became worth a lot less. So suddenly American products were worth a lot less. So Europeans bought more American products. Americans bought fewer European products, and the rest of the world basically did the same. So that meant that suddenly all of these European manufacturers were having a harder time to sell products. Now the companies that were most resilient were in North and Western Europe. They were Dutch companies and German companies that had invested over the past 50 years in making sure they could deal with these kind of things. But in Southern Europe, they were used to being able to like also make their currency cheaper. So that means that if Greece had not been in the euro, they could have probably just devalued their currency a bit more. They wouldn't have had like the entire total collapse that we see now, because every time a company collapses, it also means that the people that used to work there don't have money to buy products from other people in that country anymore. So there's like huge knock-on effects. So that is one of the actual harms. The Netherlands and for Germany, it's pretty dope. We get pretty much all of the advantages without any of the disadvantages. And we also have the political power to keep imposing this on the rest of Europe, because Germany is the biggest contributor to the to the EU, and it can basically tell other countries to like fuck off, we're not going to pay anymore, and they just have to deal with it. Yeah.
Okay.
Cool. So the gains are a lot smaller than what people sometimes think they are, and a failure in a single country can basically drag down the whole currency. So the reason we did give money to Greece was that if Greece did collapse, then the euro as a whole would like lose intrinsic value. The reputation of Greece would basically spread to other countries in the Mediterranean, and because there's all of these effects that occur there, it basically meant that, for example, Spain might have collapsed, Italy might have collapsed. It sets in motion like a domino effect, basically.
And how does that domino effect work in practice?
Okay, so people bought government bonds in the euro for a while, right? And they said like, oh, everyone has the same currency, so that means that buying a Greek bond must be equally risky as buying a Dutch bond. This is how they fought for like 10 years. So people bought like, it didn't really matter if you bought a German bond or a Greek bond, people thought the risk was the same, so the reward was the same as well. Then in the financial crisis, they discovered, hey, that's not the case at all. Greece is not financially robust at all, it's going to collapse. So then you see that suddenly these interest rates start deviating again. People think the risk for Greece is higher, so the reward for basically investing in them becomes higher as well. Now, for people, it's easier to see that Greece and Germany are different, but it's very hard for them to see that Spain and Greece are different. When they're both like not doing very well economically, when they're both like suddenly doing much worse than everyone expected. So if Greece would have collapsed, it would have basically sent a signal that, hey, even though we're in the euro, we could technically all collapse. Pay the debts they already have. So that makes it more likely that they are going to collapse. Now, if the second country collapses, so that's basically how the domino effect spreads to one country. If that country also collapses, then that signal becomes even stronger when it reaches the third country, and it basically spreads on and on and on and on. Yeah? Note furthermore that because we are now an economic union, Greek citizens did buy German products. So if Greek citizens are suddenly all like unemployed and don't have any money anymore, and the same applies to Spain and the same applies to Italy, then German producers also lose a way to basically make money. So it means that they're all hit in that way. This house believes that the IMF and ECB should not set conditions on the provisions of English loans. Yeah.
This was made with a fresh mind and no fatigue.
Yeah, I mean, I had the same last time. It's a huge word chart. So we might skip the last one.
That's fine.
This house believes that the IMF and ECB should set conditions on the provisions of English loans. So this debate is about a lot of things. It's the Devaluing Utrecht semi-final. So, who can tell me what do you guys think this debate is about? I can look at you, your most experience. Shoot.
Oh shit, me?
Yeah.
Oh.
What's the major
I was still
clash?
looking. Probably if you can pay it back.
If you can pay it back.
Like, do you have control over whether you would pay it back, and therefore, because it's like a collaboration between different countries, like I guess a kind of domino effect on the rest?
So there's basically, you basically make the impact bigger or failure, right? But that can be the same under both sides of the house, because one of the clashes might be on, does this make countries more or less likely to fail when there's conditions? Yeah, dear?
We're just thinking about what does provisions mean? Like, what does it mean?
What is giving out?
What does provisions mean? Oh, so never mind. Okay, figure out. Okay, yeah. So yeah, I think it's about who has the power, who's going to get hit the most, right? So if you have, for example, the IMF, the ECB setting conditions to, for example, Greece or whatever country, whatever other country needs emergency loans, you can be really cutthroat and make sure you profit off them, for example, by restructuring the loans in a very aggressive rate. And the IMF and ECB, European Central Bank, are very Western focused. Maybe let's like
That's the same as before.
Yeah. So it's like the who should benefit and conditions maybe. I mean, I assume conditions in general means that you say the Greek need to reform.
Yeah.
Or
That's
whatever like that, and that is in the interest on the short term, not for the Greek because they will suffer because they need to, like you said, explain. But it is to protect on the one hand, but on that is about who should be free, who should have the authority over their own country, stuff like that. All these things.
So this debate to some degree, I'm just going to sit down, is about when do countries recover the most easily. So the case again is the same. These restrictions are so bad. Look at Greece, which collapsed and lost like 20% of their economy, what I told you before, basically. But as an opposition, we can also say what I said before, right? Remember that if the IMF did not set conditions, then perhaps nobody would be able to provide a loan because nobody trusts them enough that they're going to pay it back. They won't get any loan, it'd be fucked even worse. So that's like one of the clashes, like, is this good or bad for the economy? So is it good or bad for the individual country that they get forced in the short run to do something that's in their interest in the long run? That's one of the clashes. Another one of the clashes is indeed, like, who should we care more about? Should we care about the German citizens that are giving money to Greece for nothing? Or should we care more about the Greeks that are basically, like, it's a clash that the Greeks are likely to win in this case, in this debate. But something you should consider anyway, because it casts a bit of doubt. It's like, there's always going to be someone, you're still screwing someone else over.
Yeah.
You bring us in the political dynamic, saying that there's no bailout clause, and we're already violating that principle. If we're violating it without provisions, then we're violating it more, creating more distance.
No, I wouldn't do that. Yeah, actually, yeah, you could do that. But you need to link it very clear to the expectations that people have of the European Union. So that's also one of the debates, is basically about where does the European Union function better. If we provide these loans, even though there's a lot of restrictions and people basically resent the West, or if we provide these without restrictions and people from the West basically resent the East more, like, which is worse. Another thing this was about is the political effect on individual countries, and this was what Gigi and David did, I think they were a team, which was very interesting, where they basically talked about, so if there's no provisions, if there's no conditions, so what their line was basically that if there's conditions, then people are always going to be afraid to basically accept this loan and to start restructuring, right? Because if you're the politician that brings austerity to your country, people are going to hate you forever and you're never going to be in political power again.
What does austerity mean just for?
Austerity is saving money and raising taxes. This is a word you definitely need to know for everything.
Yeah, it's
No, it's fine. That's why it's a good money. Just keep it in mind. So you're never going to be that politician. So everyone is going to try to not accept it. So they're basically going to say, okay, well, the economy is going to collapse, but I'm just going to guess it collapses after I'm president. The next government can deal with it. And then the next government says, you guys can handle it. And it goes on and on and on. And they said, okay, if there's no conditions, we can make it more likely that someone accepts it early on, uses that money to make some reforms, even though they're not as strict because we can't force them to, we're going to make some reforms, and then there's less of a chance that there's going to be an economic collapse later on. So they use that mechanism to basically explain how the politicians in these countries respond to these restrictions, to basically make it more likely that these countries will basically reform on their own. And then you get less reform, but on a better time frame, so it's actually better for these countries. So that's like one way you can tackle this. But it was very interesting. Not necessarily debate winning, but
Okay, so you said something about if you don't have conditions, then people don't trust you, so they're not likely to pay you back. What is the harm of people not paying back the IMF?
Nobody's going to loan anymore. So the way you get money as a government is people buying your bonds. But if nobody thinks you're ever going to pay back those bonds, then why would they loan you any money? It's going to be very hard for Greece to find money on the open market so they can actually borrow it. So what these conditions do is they basically set out a framework, they set an obligation to Greece, they have to pay back, they have to take steps to like save costs, for example, to make it more likely that they can pay back, makes you more likely to pay them, to basically allow them to have your money for a while, and to have them pay you less because you think the risk is lower.
Yeah, so these conditions are about Greece paying back, for instance, other countries, and not necessarily Greece paying back the IMF.
Yeah, so these conditions are just about like, okay, Greece, you have been borrowing way too much money, you need to start saving and pay back more in general. Which, that's how it affects like the open market. Okay. Because Greece borrows from all over.
We should also discuss the
Okay,
nature
wait,
of
just one specific thing. So, remember when countries step to the IMF is after all other sources have been exhausted, right? After they can no longer borrow profit, like cheaply on the open market and stuff. So they probably have like a huge amount of debt that's still in the open market, that's probably for a very high interest rate. And because they now have the trust of the IMF stepping in, they can basically renegotiate the old interest rate and basically decrease those as well. So that's one of the ways to proceed.
We should also discuss whether the nature of those provisions are going to imply a short-term return, which is going to be aggressive and not very integrative.
Yeah.
Or one that
So this is about your characterization of how the IMF operates. Are these like white bureaucrats that step in and just apply textbook economics and then everything blows up? And like, I love this extension. I'm going to stretch first. This is the last thing we're talking. Right? Okay. Let's get some energy in there. Okay, China, growing class that wants to say, but hey, China's authoritarian and communist, so what does that mean? It means that the Chinese government can always step over, it can always step in and take over banks. It means the Chinese government uses this to basically respond and loan more money, like aggressively from these banks, basically spends it recklessly, and the government's highly unpredictable in doing both of these. So, it's very unsafe to save there. I wouldn't want to save my money in a bank that could collapse at any time because the Chinese government basically extracts all of the money it can and makes all of the decisions based not on the safety and what they care about me as a consumer, but what they care about as a government. Normally, you can just buy land, right? If you're in the Netherlands, you just, okay, I can't save in a bank, I'll just buy a house because you know a house can never, I want to say a house can never collapse. Okay, that's not true. But like a piece of land in Amsterdam is very unlikely to lose its value in the short run. So you're like, oh, that's been kind of safe. But because China's communist, you can't actually buy land there. I don't know if this is true, doesn't really matter. You can just say it's very hard to buy land, it's not profitable to buy land, because I think you can only like lease land for the Chinese government, so you can do that. It's like you're kind of renting, which is not what you want to do. You want to buy it and then sell it later for profits, you want it to be worth it. So what happens? What do these people in China do? What do these people in China do? They can still buy land elsewhere. They can go to the United States, they can go to Canada, they can go to the UK and the Netherlands, and they can buy land there, which is dope, because it's never going to go away, and it's a pretty safe investment in these countries because they're stable. And sometimes, all you need to do to get dual citizenship, which these people care about, is just having some land there, because you can say you lived there, right? You had a house in the UK for 10 years. Why would I do that if I didn't live there from time to time? I deserve a UK passport, which these people care about because the Chinese government is like pretty scary to these people because they might be targets of the proletariat any other day, right? They have a bit more money than the rest, they're a bit more successful, so it's kind of scary. This is why specifically Chinese investors do that. So they start buying up land and houses in major Western cities. Okay, so remember, these are like individual Chinese people. They've seen like some movies and some theater and whatnot, and maybe read some newspapers. So which are the places they're likely to go to?
London.
London, Paris,
LA.
Toronto, Sydney, major cities that they can spot on the map and say, I know that place, I'm gonna buy a house there. So it's very concentrated, and that's how bubbles start. So what happens? People buy houses, and they sort of anticipate a price increase, right? They think like, okay, past years, land usually becomes more expensive for like 2% every year, so it's a little bit, but I don't really care. I just want like a safe investment. I don't really care about the return. That's the first group that steps in, right? That's these Chinese people. So suddenly demand goes up because there's all of these Chinese people that want like safe investment, and prices go up a bit more. So now prices are increasing by 5% per year instead of 2% because a lot of people want this. Demand is very high, supply is the same because it's like because it's land. You can't make more land unless you're Dutch. So it generally tends to stay the same. So people buy more houses. Now a second group comes in, they're like, oh, this is pretty safe. Also, it's now 5%. I want to buy this even more. So there's even more people that step in. Demand grows even more, supply still fixed. So you know what happens. So now a small but critical mass can start one of these bubbles. It can ignite the flame. Specifically, because what I told you before, they know a lot of, they don't really know much about the global housing market. They don't even care. So they just go to the same cities. They go to a couple hotspots. And so this first wave, it goes to the cities we discussed before. Now the second wave, they just see interest return and they just see return rates and risks. And they see, oh look, in Paris and Amsterdam and London, all of these housing prices are rising by 10%. Why would I invest in like, what's the lamest city you can think of? Why would I buy a house in Tilburg?
Almelo.
In Almelo, why would I buy a house in Almelo if I get 5% there, but I can buy one in London and I get 10%? That's objectively a better calculation for me to make. So this second group concentrates at these first hotspots. So you get like a couple of fires that ignite because of a match, and they suddenly become like tinders. Yes, that's a word. So these housing bubbles basically spread asymmetrically. They're not like spread out across everyone because then it wouldn't be that big a deal, but they're in specific places where the supply is very fixed, so it's very hard for this to basically get small. And a few hotspots was the capital. So what happens? Locals can't buy houses anymore because prices in Amsterdam have increased by like, let's say 25% the past 5 years. It's a ridiculous amount of money. So if I'm a starter, there's no way I'm going to be able to buy a house there. There's no way Bonaparte is going to be able to buy their clubhouse now that the government's taking it back because it's become too expensive for the club for like these free purposes.
They had a clubhouse.
They had a clubhouse.
Yeah,
And they
with
bought
their
it.
own bar.
And they sold it?
No, the government gave it to them, but then they took it back.
Oh, it's just sad.
Renters are pushed out of their homes because if the land underneath your huge flat building suddenly doubles in value, then the person that rents that money basically rents your apartment to you is going to say, you're going to have to start paying me more because I could also sell this to a major corporation for way more money than I could before. So you need to start paying me more. So these renters either pay more rent, which sucks, or they're pushed out of their homes because they can't pay these rents. Homeowners, faced with higher taxes. Let's say you already own a home. Suddenly its value is raised from 200,000 euros to 300,000 euros. That means you need to pay more taxes on that value because you're sitting on a pile of gold. So you basically need to pay taxes for that. So even if you're like stable and you have a house, so you know if you disregard the abstract, you really shouldn't be affected, then you're still going to be affected. You also lose a lot of value when that bubble inevitably bursts. When people realize, wait, Amsterdam isn't really that special. It's not worth like 4 times as much as, for example, Almelo is. So why the fuck am I buying here? And then suddenly people start opting out of this system, and because the whole value was built on the expectation that other people are going to buy your house, it collapses in on itself. If you have one of these houses, you've been paying taxes for 10 years on the higher artificial value. You've also been expecting that when you were going to use it for your pension later, you could use all of that money, but now it's suddenly gone. It means you actually do kind of lose like 100,000 euros because you thought you didn't need to save as much because you could always sell your house later on. A house is like something people use as a pension fund as well. So that's why it's so specifically dramatic when you get these housing crises and stuff, because it's a huge part of your life. It's a huge part of your life planning as well. Plus, if you need to like sell your house because you have like, what's it called? Hypotheek, mortgage, then you're fucked over. You need to move somewhere else. It's like you need to. Are you still going to be able to go to your job if you live in the center of Amsterdam, but now you got to move to Almelo? Are you still going to be able to work in the same place? Are your kids going to have the same school? How am I going to deal with my day-to-day activities? It's a huge effect.
Just a tip for everyone, don't even bother moving to Almelo. Like, you wouldn't like it.
Okay, so some general tips. Always talk about, these are the same from the IR thing, so always talk about like the internal politics. You can talk about how China operates, what do the people in China care about, blah, blah, blah. So for example, like I said this in the IR workshop, I'll go through really quickly. You could just say, China, there's two political groups. You have nationalists who care about like protecting domestic industries, and you have the liberals who care about free trade and growing the economy as big as possible. How this policy affects either of these groups determines how China responds to things, determines like what the world does. Yeah. Internal minorities, you can specifically talk about like how starters in the Dutch housing market are like affected more. So like minorities that live in like poor neighborhoods in Amsterdam that have suddenly become super expensive, that are basically being kicked out of their homes, out of their communities by, you know, would impose severe restrictions on non-citizens' rights to purchase property. When I talked about this in Rotterdam, people actually have very interesting ideas about like how buying property is a way to like buy into a society, right? Because there's nothing that says you are now part of the Netherlands more than owning a little piece of it, and like building your house there and like, making your children grow up. It should be an intrinsic right. And it also makes people more likely to like integrate into Dutch society and to buy into that, which kind of feeds back on like severe restrictions on non-citizens, right? Because you're specifically doing this for people who aren't yet a part of your society. You're specifically restricting them. What's the signal this sends to the rest of society? We can't trust these people because they're just buying houses to screw you over. Now remember that you do not need Chinese investors to be the biggest group buying things in your house, in your country. If they buy a couple of houses and they start that critical mass, it can still be Dutch people, which I think it are, that are buying Amsterdam's houses and like trying to sell it for a profit. But once that small tender starts and the bigger fire starts coming, it doesn't really matter who started it because people just flock to money. Very depressing. That's why I love it.
One question, what happens if such a small bubble bursts? The effects are somewhat minor compared to a overall housing
Yes,
bubble.
the bubbles are always very intense for those that are in the bubble. You can always frame it that way. So even if it becomes a marginal debate, if you can make the individual impacts on like individuals in that bubble very big, and you can even make it worse, right? You can even explain if it's a tiny bubble, it's not going to get media attention. Nobody's going to help these people. You're fucked even worse if your house gets taken away and the mortgage is paid.
Yeah, but those bubbles take place on a regular basis, right?
Yeah, but they're worse.
There's a cycle.
Hmm?
There's a cycle that deviates based on like major world events, like Chinese government prosecutes a minority which starts coming out properly.
So what's your point?
So they could be predicted.
No. You cannot predict bubbles. Amsterdam right now is a housing bubble. I can tell you that right now. I can't tell you when it's going to end. I can't tell you any useful information about when Bitcoin bubble is going to burst, for example. So you really can't predict these things. You can say, okay, this is a bubble. So here's some advice to all of you. Don't buy Bitcoin. Don't buy the house in Amsterdam right now. But I can't tell you if it's going to burst in like 20 years or in 5 years or in 5 months because it's a bubble. And these things are built on like erratic expectations because people think that other people are going to buy more, and as long as most people think that other people are going to pay them more in 10 years than they are going to pay than they have to pay to get it today, then they're going to keep buying these just for the monetary value.
Yeah.
Also, I think that even if we didn't have Chinese investors, or even if we pass this policy, there'll still be bubbles. We'll just have fewer bubbles and it'll be less bad, and we can just talk about